Dan, I want to start with the Apple story and understand it from your perspective. Do you see that as profit, revenue lost, or just deferred, pushed out to the next quarter?
Look, I mean, it's been a gut punch in the most important quarter, the most important period for Cook and Cupertino going into holidays. I believe it is deferred, and ultimately demand right now is outstripping supply by about 3-1. But I think really, look, the clock struck midnight. Finally, Apple is seeing, what's really the hurt in terms of production in China. We think it could be 6 to 8 million units.
So what does this mean in terms of Apple's share price, in terms of the earnings that they're going to see, even if it's deferred? What does that mean for the upcoming quarter?
Well, I think in the near term, Street's factoring in that you're clearly going to see misses on iPhone production as well as what we're going to see on deliveries. I think, Lisa, the issue is even going to Black Friday, I mean, we're seeing a 25%, potentially 30% shortages in Apple stores. If that continues to increase, depending on what happens on production, then this could be some darker days ahead in terms of the coming weeks going into holidays. But I think right now, Street's starting to factor that in. But let's just be clear. It's the Grinch that stole Christmas, really for Apple. And it's been a frustrating time for Cook and Cupertino.
This isn't a surprise, though, Dan. I mean, this is ultimately Apple's China problem, that their dependence on China, both from a demand side as well as a supply side, really ties their hands to policy that's highly unpredictable. How much is there a push internally to move away from production in China to increase, perhaps, demand and production elsewhere?
Yeah, and in terms of what we've seen even over the last year and a half, Apple's been able to navigate basically better than any other company, within China. The problem is that now at the most important time between the protests, zero COVID, and what we're seeing in Foxconn, it's really been a train wreck. I think for Apple now, they could talk about diversifying, but realistically, probably best case, they can move 5-7% production out of China by 2024. So I think that really hands are tied here, and that's sort of the frustrating situation because they are ultimately at the mercy of the zero COVID policy in China.
Well, Dan, let's build on that a little bit more. When asked the question whether it's profit or revenue lost or just delayed, deferred to another quarter, I think overwhelmingly the response from bulls like you is that it's deferred, just delayed until the next quarter. But Dan, underlying that assumption is that these difficulties in production go away over the next 3 months. Dan, I've spent most of this morning asking a question whether the working assumption is we get rid of COVID zero or whether we're stuck with it. And I can't get a definitive answer on that from anyone. And unsurprisingly, that's the case. So Dan, where does your confidence come from that the issues that these companies are experiencing this quarter are temporary in nature and won't just spill over into most of next year?
Look, it's a great question. I mean, look, our view is that, ultimately, especially from a Foxconn perspective, they will be able to ramp production going into the next month or two, and then ultimately this will start to be more temporary. But to your point, it's an overhang. And it's really something that came to roost for Apple at the worst time possible. And really, ultimately, right now, the Street's going to assume it's temporary, transitionary. But ultimately, if this continues in 2023, it would really sort of start to change the near-term thesis.
Well, that's the question you and I have explored a few times, Dan. How will I know if I'm wrong? You seem to have put a date on it there, if it spills into 2023. Is that fair? Is that your line? If this continues for another month or so, I may have to change my mind about where I see this thesis going?
Yeah, if this continues for 4 to 6 weeks, look, then it starts to impact 2023. Then even iPhone 15 in terms of production, I think that's where it sort of cascades further. Right now it's contained. You see that even reflected in the stock. But no doubt, I mean, this is starting to turn into a nightmare on Elm Street for Apple in terms of what we're seeing coming out of China.
It's contained, and yet we have heard about Apple potentially giving discounts to certain businesses on the margins, doing things that they have not done before because demand has so outstripped supply. And there's always been a willingness to spend $1,000 on a phone and people lining up around the block. Dan, is there a bigger problem for Apple that they're seeing both this issue on the supply side at the same time that demand is taking a hit in a way that perhaps they're starting to acknowledge on the edges?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the edges, you saw that in iPhone 14 Plus, which is really outside a strikeout in terms of as an overall, deliveries. But if I look at iPhone Pro, in terms of 14 Pro, it's 3-1 demand over supply. That continues to be robust. That's the frustrating thing for Apple. Even despite economic storm clouds, demand strong. They can't produce it. And I think that's right now what they're trying to figure out. And I think this is a key, I'll call it 7 to 10 days ahead, especially what we see coming out of Foxconn.